take some time for, all right, good to know. Yeah, so with that said, we will be recording this. Hopefully, if everything goes well, we'll be able to upload this at the end. So hold on to that. Yeah, so we're going to go ahead and take some time to introduce our guests, introduce PERCoGS, and then we'll move on to the presentation, right? So welcome, everybody. My name is Brian Samarripa Roman. I'm a grad student at the University of Central Florida. This event has been hosted by PERCoGS and the PERCoGS leadership. Thank you all so much for engaging and being here. Again, PERCoGS is the Physics Education Research Consortium of graduate students. If you're not familiar with our organization, we have a website, percogs.com. Feel free to look us up. So today we kick off the first event of our series. We're gonna have a four speaker series running through January, pretty much addressing our student needs on how to learning how to do research, right? How to implement methodologies and all that. So we hope to address some of those topics with our featured guests. Today's our first guest is going to be Dr. Katelyn Cooper. Dr. Katie Cooper, she's from Arizona, got her bachelor's degree and PhD from Arizona State University. She spent some time at the University of Central Florida doing biology education research, and now she's back as an assistant professor back at Arizona State University, her alma mater. So Dr. Katie Cooper has done some research on a lot of topics concerning equity. Some of her interesting publications is that of Coming Out in Class, Challenges and Benefits of Active Learning in a Biology Classroom for LGBTQIA Students, or other publications such as A Bridge to Active Learning, a summer bridge program helps students to maximize their active learning experiences and the active learning experiences of others. So today's talk is actually going to be on the effects from biology learning environments and the effects on students' mental health. So with that said, please give us some hype in the chat for our featured guest, Dr. Katie Cooper. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate you.
All right, well, thank you all so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's great to be here today. And yeah, I'm very excited to talk with you about some of my research focused on identifying and lessening the challenges for undergraduates with anxiety and depression in biology learning environments. So as many of you may know, anxiety and depression are prominent among our undergraduates. And in fact, these are the top two mental health concerns among undergraduates, and the rates of both just continue to rise. Specifically, we see that about a quarter of our US college students self-report having been diagnosed with depression, and 63% of undergraduates report feeling overwhelming anxiety within the past year. Something that's incredibly important to my research focused on creating a more diverse and inclusive scientific community is recognizing that anxiety and depression disproportionately affect underrepresented and underserved students in science, including women, first generation college students, individuals from low socioeconomic backgrounds, as well as members of the LGBTQ+ community. So the overarching goal of my lab and my research is to work toward creating a more diverse and inclusive scientific community. And as such, I argue that understanding the challenges that our students with anxiety and depression experience in biology learning environments and developing strategies to lessen those challenges can enhance the learning and the retention of underserved students in biology, which is a concrete step toward creating a more diverse and inclusive scientific community. So today I'd like to walk you through some projects that I have done focused on answering the question, how do anxiety and depression impact students' experiences in biology learning environments? And I study a wide range of biology learning environments, but today I'm going to hone in on two, and those are active learning classrooms and undergraduate research experiences. So let's begin by thinking about active learning classrooms. Well, this is a great group to present to because I don't think that I have to convince you that increasingly our college science courses are being transitioned from traditional lecture to active learning. And when I say active learning, the definition that I'm using is the type of learning that engages our students in the process of learning through activities and or discussions in class. Active learning often involves higher order thinking and includes group work. Now, why are classes transitioning to active learning? Well, as many of you know, studies have shown that on average, compared to traditional lecture courses, students are learning more and failing less in active learning. And a really important assumption that underlies a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about today is that active learning increases the interactions, both among students as well as between students and instructors in the classroom. And as such, my previous work has established that this increased number of interactions can present novel challenges for students with different identities. And this ranges from women to students with disabilities to LGBTQ+ students. And so I would be very hypocritical if I told you that people learn more when they do active learning and then lectured at you for 50 minutes. So I want to go ahead and do some active learning. And I want you to take a minute and think about the question below, and then go ahead and type your thoughts into the chat if you're willing. What negative impacts might the social aspects of active learning have on students? So go ahead, think about that question, and then share in the chat once you have some ideas. Okay, great. We're starting to get some ideas in the chat, ranging from perhaps students experience stereotype threat and may be worried about what they're actually sharing with someone. Perhaps some people are dominating conversations, more about evoking stereotype threat. Some ideas that social interactions might be particularly stressful for our students with anxiety or students with autism. And yeah, going back to that idea of sharing different anxiety or sharing different ideas now in front of people might be particular anxiety inducing. These are really great ideas, and I think I'm going to touch on a bunch of them as I share with you what we found. So keep in mind what you were thinking about and how it compares to some of the work that we've done and what we found. All right, so let's dive into anxiety in the context of active learning. So what do we know about anxiety in college? Well, anxiety has recently increased in prevalence among undergraduates. And in fact, 45% of college students report that they regularly struggle with anxiety. And about a quarter of students report that anxiety negatively affects their academic performance. But you might be thinking, okay, but not all anxiety is bad. Anxiety is what gets our students often to class. Anxiety gets students to study, and you're totally right. So not all anxiety is bad. Therapy's thoughts and law suggest that performance increases with anxiety, but only up to a moderate level. And after that, then you see a decrease in performance. And so that's why we've seen so many studies that have emphasized that high levels of anxiety can negatively affect not only student motivation, but also student performance. And further, in our field of biology, we found that students with high levels of anxiety are less likely to persist in introductory biology than students with lower anxiety. But how does active learning actually influence anxiety? Well, there's a study in our field that has shown that active learning courses can increase student anxiety. And particularly this study looked at active learning practices and how students perceive particular practices. However, if you really dive deep into the literature and you look at, active learning practices before we had this term active learning, you'll see that a lot of active learning courses have also been shown to decrease student anxiety. And that's, really along the lines with what we might think, right? It's probably not all one direction or the other. But I was really interested to see that no studies had identified specifically why active learning and active learning practices affect student anxiety. So the research question that drove this project was what specific aspects of large enrollment active learning science classes influence student anxiety? So to answer this question, we chose to conduct a large-scale, in-depth interview study And we recruited 52 undergraduates who were enrolled in large enrollment active learning biology courses at a research-intensive institution. And we conducted hour-long semi-structured interviews about how students' anxiety levels were affected in large enrollment active learning science courses. All right, so I said I'd talk a little bit about methods, so why an interview study? Well, there was nothing in the prior literature that could inform a survey. So when we had to go figure out, what are some of these reasons that students might choose as to why their anxiety was being affected, there really wasn't much to build on. And so for that, we would have to then come up with our own predetermined factors that we hypothesized influenced student anxiety. And we were worried that we may have been short-sighted, right? So I identify with having anxiety, but I also come with my own biases. Other people on my team didn't have any anxiety, so they might not have as much to contribute. And further, this is not something that students think a lot about regularly. And I know that now that I've conducted these interviews. So this is something to think deeply about, whether or not the students that you're interviewing are going to have thought about this in their spare time, just when they're thinking about their everyday things, or whether this is going to be a totally new question for them to consider. And it also depends how you're recruiting, right? Did you recruit students with anxiety and active learning, or did you recruit students? And in this case, we recruited broadly students who were in active learning classes because we didn't want to scare anyone away from engaging, and we also wanted students with a broad range of anxiety levels. So how did we select our sample? Well, we chose to recruit from active learning biology courses at a single institution. We knew the way that a lot of faculty taught at this particular institution, and there was a lot of varied ways of doing active learning. And so we thought that this would roughly resemble what was happening at other institutions. But again, our point wasn't to be able to say what was happening across the board. We just really wanted to see what was happening at this institution, and then we could see to what extent that could be replicated across institutions at other times. So importantly, once students came in for the interview, we defined what we meant by active learning and asked students to think about all active learning courses that they had taken and not necessarily one specific course. So all active learning science courses. So we didn't have any a priori hypotheses about what we were going to find. So we used inductive coding to review all interviews and identified aspects of active learning that influenced student anxiety. And codes were organized into themes, which I'll present, and we used pseudonyms to protect students' identities. So when we interviewed students about active learning and anxiety, they commonly discussed 3 practices. So they talked about clicker questions or interactive response tools that instructors can use to pose a question and students can use a clicker to click in their answer. And often, notably, the instructor will put up a histogram to show students how the class responded. Group work and cold call, random call, or instructors who call on students to answer a question when they don't volunteer. So what did we find? We found that active learning provides students with opportunities to compare their knowledge with others, which can either increase or decrease their anxiety. Particularly, students talked about how in traditional lecture, they'll often sit there and feel like the dumbest person in the room, that everyone else gets it and they're assuming that they're the only one who doesn't. So Anne explains, when I'm having trouble with content, it's probably because I'm stupid and don't understand. But then talking with other students helps me realize, okay, everyone else is struggling with the same concept, or someone else has the same question. So I think it probably helps more with more dense concepts and subjects that are just complicated. It kind of helps students relate to other students as well. So it's a great way in active learning when students are interacting to check in and realize that they're not the only one who's struggling with a concept. However, in cases where active learning does present that opportunity for a student to realize that they know less than another student, this can increase their anxiety. Particularly, Lindsay said, I feel anxious when everyone else understands the concept and I don't. When the instructor puts up the graph after a clicker question and says, all these people say C and this majority says D, I'm usually the B people. In that moment, it's like, how are people understanding it? I feel so dumb. I don't understand how people get it and I can't. Additionally, we found that students' relationships with others in their group can either increase or decrease their anxiety. Particularly, students explain that if they're more comfortable with their groupmate, this can decrease their anxiety. And I think Carly does such a great example, or gives such a great example of why this is. She says, I feel less uncomfortable bouncing ideas off of my friend in class, because when you say something to someone and it's the first thing you've ever said to them, it makes a big impression, or at least it feels that way. Whereas my friend has known me for a year, so even if I say something stupid, she still knows I'm smart. Now, conversely, if a student's more uncomfortable with their groupmate, this can increase their anxiety. So for example, Craig said, if I realize I answered a question wrong when talking with people in my group, it makes my anxiety worse. I'm sitting there thinking, oh man, this person next to me probably thinks I'm dumb because I just shared with him the wrong idea. So this was exactly what a lot of you hit on in the chat. And finally, and perhaps most excitingly for me, we identified this construct of fear of negative evaluation, which is underlying student anxiety in active learning. And when I say fear of negative evaluation, I'm talking about the fear of being negatively evaluated or being judged while participating in a social situation. So Celeste describes this when she says, that's what I'm afraid of when getting called on in front of the whole class, getting it completely wrong, or not saying anything. If you don't know, you're that one person who seems stupid. That's what I feel like. Not knowing the answer makes me feel anxious, makes me feel like I'm the outcast, the stupid one. And similarly, it was described by Parker, who said, my anxiety during group work goes back to the central theme of being judged. Some things I say will keep me awake at night. It's like, oh, did I overshare? Did I not talk enough? So when we recognized this fear of negative evaluation as something that was underlying anxiety, we were really interested in how it was affecting our students. So we went back through the interviews to look for evidence of how it might be affecting our students. And we saw it was primarily affecting our students in two ways. First, it seemed to inhibit their ability to think through a science problem. So Quinn described, it's the pressure of having to answer a question in front of all of your peers that causes me anxiety. It clouds your thinking and then you can't think at all and it just gets worse. Your heart is racing, you start to sweat, and your brain just shuts off. So we've seen this in our students. We see them thinking and then they get nervous and they think they're gonna get called on and they go blank, right? And this has happened, I'm sure, to many of you. It's happened to me. And so this is one of those issues and one of the reasons that if a student is in a high anxiety situation, their learning could be impeded. But for our students who were able to think through the question, we also found that it seemed to inhibit their ability to articulate their thoughts about science. So for example, Serena said, being randomly called, that level of anxiety, it just throws me. When anticipating being called on by the instructor, I know the answer in my head, but just being in that moment, being called on, I wasn't able to put my thoughts into a clear, coherent sentence. It just made me feel bad and sick to my stomach. It doesn't really help you because then you're just inhibited. So in sum, we found that how students think their knowledge compares to other students' knowledge, as well as students' relationship with their groupmate, influences their levels of anxiety in active learning. And we identified this novel construct of fear of negative evaluation in science active learning classes that exclusively increases student anxiety. So the question that I was getting most often at conferences and when I was giving talks is, do these findings transfer to small enrollment courses? And again, we were doing an exploratory study. We hadn't scaled this up. We hadn't actually surveyed students. But we were getting a lot of feedback, particularly from community college instructors, that suggested that their classes may be really, really different. They were much smaller, they're able to form those relationships. So we might be totally off base if we're trying to make any assumptions that this is what's happening in smaller enrollment courses. So we thought that was a really interesting question. So we decided to repeat the same interview study with 29 students from 9 community colleges. And these classes, we're recruiting them from active learning science courses that ranged from 24 to 48 students. Now, community colleges are notably smaller and there are many fewer courses and therefore many fewer folks who are teaching in an active learning way. So we couldn't go through the same recruitment process as we did with the first study. This is why we decided to do this across 9 campuses. We emailed the director of each biology department and asked them to send out our recruitment email to all biology instructors in their department. The recruitment email defined active learning and asked the instructor who taught asked instructors who taught in an active learning way to share a recruitment script with their classes. Now, because there were people in our community who perceived that community college courses could be extremely different than four-year courses, we didn't want to make any assumptions. So we opted for the interview approach this time as well. And we were able to basically use a very similar interview script based on the initial study, because the interview script was so open-ended in allowing students to come up with these ideas themselves. And we probed what factors affect student anxiety in small enrollment active learning science courses. And surprisingly, we found really similar findings in the context of active learning courses. And so we wrote this up, and I'll share this paper with you at the end. But the takeaway here was our findings were really, really similar. And so this has set us up really nicely so that now we're going to be able to measure what factors affect student anxiety at scale. So now that we've established the primary factors that affect student anxiety in active learning, we're set up to examine them using a national interview study across active learning courses, probing what factors affect student anxiety. And this would allow us to look at the most frequently reported factors, right? What factors are affecting all students versus a small proportion of students? We're also going to be able to look at whether particular factors affect our students with really high anxiety versus factors that maybe affect students with a range of levels of anxiety. And it would allow us to compare across course size, across institution type. So there's a lot of questions that we can now answer now that we've done this groundwork. And all of this is coming post-COVID-19. So unfortunately, that threw a little bit of a wrench in our plans, but this is what's coming and the questions we'll be able to answer. All right, so now that we've talked a little bit about anxiety and active learning, I want to switch to talking about depression. So specifically, depression is a mood disorder that results in persistent feelings of sadness and hopelessness. And as I mentioned before, about a quarter of our college students struggle with depression, and depression rates are actually higher among university students compared to the general population. Now, previous work that I've done and just published has established that students with disabilities, including some students with depression who recognize their depression as a disability, face challenges in active learning classes. However, there have been no studies that have focused exclusively on the experiences of students with depression in active learning. And so my lab and I have hypothesized that these increased number of interactions and the increased number of assignments and demands on students in active learning could present unique challenges for our students with depression. And so we landed on, again, for the same reasons as I described before, conducting a semi-structured interview study, focusing on how, if at all, active learning affects depression, and then how depression in turn affects student experiences in active learning classes. And we went about this by recruiting undergrads who have depression, who self-report having depression, who had been enrolled in at least one active learning science course at a large research-intensive institution. But unfortunately, just as the study ramped up, COVID-19 hit and we went online. So we were literally right in the middle of starting up this study and interviewing students. And I was at UCF as an assistant professor at the time, and everything went online. And so then I chose to ultimately not continue with this study at this time. And I chose this for a few reasons. One, it was a super trying time for our students. If you guys remember how stressful that transition was when our students were suddenly going home, flying across the country, taking care of relatives, figuring out how to do online courses, all their coursework was a mess. And it just felt like it wasn't the time to start to ask them these questions. Additionally, their depression, if they have depression, was going to be affected probably by many more factors during this time of exacerbated stress. And I predicted it would affect their ability to recall their experiences in active learning. I figured they would probably just want to focus on COVID-19. And so we're going to start this study completely over again once everyone comes back and things start to return to normal again once COVID-19 passes. But I do have some results, preliminary results I can share from you, and we can see what direction this study was going in. So indeed, we did see that depressive symptoms do affect some students' experiences in active learning. I only say some students because we only interviewed some students. So Craig said, when I experience depression, I feel very unmotivated to participate in small group discussions. Additionally, I felt very self-conscious about myself and my work around the students. Now, we use this hopelessness theory when analyzing our data and to come up with some of our interview questions. And hopelessness theory applies to depression, and it shows that depression can affect people's experiences in life, often negatively, and then that negative experience in turn exacerbates students' depression, right? And it becomes this feedback loop. And this is what we expected to see, and indeed, this is exactly what students describe. So for example, Bill said, in class discussions, my depression makes it so I take longer to put my thoughts together, and another student says what I was thinking about before me. That brings a mix of sadness and embarrassment, and I leave the class feeling unaccomplished. So you can see that feedback loop. And here again with Dan, if I don't contribute enough in group work, it makes me feel worthless to the group. So it put me in a rather sour and depressed mood, and instead of going about my regular day, I just might go home and take a depression nap. So we're seeing how this can affect our students and how something that we as instructors don't even register is going on is something that our students are then going home and having to take a depression nap over, right? And so this is really interesting in that hopefully it will lead us to recognize some things that we're assuming aren't affecting our students that might be having a bigger impact than we thought. All right, so let's move on to undergraduate research experiences. I'm going to start by talking about anxiety. So I think as many of you in this virtual room know, doing undergraduate research is one of the most lucrative activities that our undergraduates can participate in. And engaging in research benefits students in so many different ways, right? It can improve their self-confidence, their tolerance to obstacles, their ability to think critically, their performance, their student learning. There are just so many different ways in which undergraduate research positively impacts our students. But a recent national survey of 760 students from 25 R1 institutions that I led found that half of our students in undergraduate research considered leaving prematurely, and about a quarter of them actually leave. So about a quarter of our all students actually leave their undergraduate research prematurely. So if you're doing any research about undergraduate research and you dove into the literature, you'll note that like 99.99% of the literature is about the positive impacts of undergraduate research. And only very recently are folks starting to talk about the fact that negative aspects of research can cause students to leave their undergraduate research experiences. So given that not all research experiences are positive, and given the prior work that suggests that student anxiety can negatively affect undergraduates in science, we hypothesized that student anxiety could affect undergraduates in research. So specifically, we aim to explore research anxiety, or feelings of worry or apprehension that are associated with working on research projects in the context of faculty member labs. And we were really interested in to what extent students plan to pursue a career in research and what the relationship between research anxiety and their future plans is. And finally, we want to account for research difficulty, or a student's perception that their research is complicated, difficult, and complex. So specifically, our research questions were, what is the relationship between research difficulty, research anxiety, and student intent to pursue a research career? And to what extent do student demographics, including gender, race, ethnicity, and GPA, predict research difficulty, research anxiety, and student intent to pursue a career in research? So quick note on terminology. In this talk, I'll use the term peer, which stands for persons excluded based on their race or ethnicity. This is an intention to move away from the term underrepresented racial minority, which has been quite critiqued lately. The term peer, in terms of my research, will include Black or African American, Latinx, or Hispanic, and peoples indigenous to the spaces comprising the United States territories. In our studies, there have been too few of these individuals in these categories in these quantitative studies to consider them separately in analyses. So we've grouped students as white, Asian, or peer based on how they self-identify. Okay, so we created a survey And this survey consisted of closed-ended questions measuring student demographics, student research anxiety, student perceived difficulty, research difficulty, student intention to pursue a research career, as well as some open-ended questions. And these open-ended questions ask students about the factors that increased their anxiety in research, as well as the factors that decrease their anxiety in research. So we were able to survey 1,272 biology majors across 87 colleges and universities who were participating in an undergraduate research experience during the academic year. What we did was we actually took the Carnegie classifications, we got every university written down, and the graduate student who was leading this project looked up each person at each institution who they thought was going to have access to all undergraduate researchers. So for some folks, that was going to be a department head. For other people, maybe there's an office of undergraduate research. It was different at every institution. And then we emailed all of those people asking them to send out our recruitment to all of the students who were doing research at their particular institution. And then on the survey, we had questions to eliminate anyone who maybe got a hold of the survey who hadn't done undergraduate research. But this yielded our 1,272 students from 87 different institutions. And then we used structural equation modeling to answer our research questions. So why a survey this time? So different than anxiety and active learning, there's lots of different research. I highlighted some of it to show that anxiety can negatively affect students in the classroom, right? We know they perform worse. We know that they're leaving biology at a greater rate, but this sort of research doesn't exist in the context of undergraduate research. So there's no research, to my knowledge, looking at anxiety and undergraduate research. And so we were really interested in establishing this relationship, particularly how anxiety affects undergrads in research. And I felt that surveying researchers across all institution types would be the strongest way to start to identify this relationship. And importantly, we were already planning to do this survey for a different project. So it was going to be relatively smart and easy to add these questions to this already developed survey that was going out to obviously this huge group of people, and a ton of time and effort had gone into the type of recruiting that we were doing. And finally, we hypothesized that students in research were likely a little older, because this usually happens as you go through your undergraduate career. And the anxiety might be more pronounced in undergraduate research experiences, so therefore it might be easier for them to think through these questions about how anxiety affects them. Okay, so let's see what we found. First, thinking about the relationship between student demographics and research difficulty. We found that compared to white students, people excluded based on their race or ethnicity or peers perceive their research as less difficult. Further, students with high GPAs perceive their research as more difficult. But what about the relationship between demographics and research anxiety? Here we found that women report higher research anxiety than men, and peers report higher research anxiety than white students. With regard to the relationship between research difficulty and research anxiety, the more difficult a student perceives their research to be, the more anxiety they have. All right, so the big question, what is the relationship between research difficulty, research anxiety, and students' intent to pursue a research career? The more difficult a student perceives the research to be, the more likely they are to pursue a research career. Now, when we think about this in terms of the GPA, it starts to make sense. Our high-performing students are students probably getting their own projects, probably getting more responsibilities. Their research is more difficult, but there also are students who are more likely to stay, right? So when we start to think about that picture, that's one idea. But despite this, the more research anxiety a student has, the less likely they are to pursue a research career. And you can see the differences in terms of the magnitude of these effects. Research anxiety has a greater effect on students' intent to pursue a research career. And we also wanted to account For students' prior intention to pursue research, it would have been awesome to do a longitudinal study. We didn't have that available. We couldn't do that. So what we did, the best we could do, was ask for students' prior intent to pursue research. So we said, before your first research experience, what would you say your intent to pursue research was? And that was on a 1 to 10 point Likert scale. And so even when we controlled for that, we still saw this relationship. So further, this is also in more complex models, we controlled for students here in school and their length of time in research, and these results also held true. Excuse me. So important discoveries here were that women and peers were disproportionately affected by research anxiety. And we identified this novel link between anxiety and students' plans to pursue research careers. And so we were really excited to have now discovered this new factor, research anxiety, which we can work to lessen in order to create a more inclusive scientific community. All right, so I'm gonna ask you to take a minute to think again and then respond to the chat. Given your prior experience as either an undergraduate or a graduate student researcher, what do you think increases undergraduate anxiety in research? All right, great. So I'm seeing ideas like encountering setbacks, maybe some failure, not having as much experience or as much understanding as other folks, lack of confidence, the type of advisor, whether your advisor is supportive, whether they're helpful, content knowledge, communication skills, and expectations. Great. So I think that you'll find that you're very good at predicting what our undergraduates struggle with. So let's compare what you thought to what we found. So we actually coded the 1,272 open-ended student responses for the factors that increased research anxiety. And I'm going to present the percent of students who reported out each factor, but keep in mind that because this question was open-ended, again, because this was an exploratory part of this research and we didn't want to give them closed responses, we're likely underrepresenting underreporting the number of students whose anxiety is affected by a particular factor. And then we use logistic regression to determine to what extent student demographics predicted whether students wrote about a particular factor that increased their anxiety. All right, so we saw 40% of our students highlighted that a lack of research success, particularly when science failed or they made a mistake, increased their anxiety. So for example, student 51 said, "What increases my anxiety is being stressed about why a reaction will not work and seeing you did everything right, but can't seem to figure out what could have went wrong." 34% of our students highlighted a lack of knowledge specifically about their research topic or how to do a certain technique. Student 37 said, "Being sent to come up with my own ideas, I didn't feel secure enough, it increased my anxiety." 14% of our students highlighted time balance. So this student said, "I want to put a lot of work into my research, but also not at the expense of my classes. I don't have enough time to do everything." And here we saw that white students were 3.7 times more likely than peer students to report the issue with time balance that increased their anxiety. Now, people were another huge factor that affects student anxiety, not surprising. 14% of students highlighted insufficient mentor guidance increased their anxiety. So student 176 said, "My faculty advisor made me feel stupid for asking questions to clarify what I was supposed to do. Not having any real guidance made the whole situation more anxious." And here we saw that women were 2.1 times more likely than men to report insufficient guidance increased their anxiety. Now, 8% of our students highlighted getting a negative response from others in the lab exacerbated their anxiety. Student 700 said, my PI gets super mad very unpredictably, and I always live in fear of the day I get yelled at. 5% of students highlighted the lab environment and said, in lab, I consistently felt different from my peers because I wasn't close friends with any of them and they were all close-knit, which increased my anxiety. And notably, Asian students were 3.2 times more likely, and peer students were 3.5 times more likely than white students to report that the lab environment increased their anxiety. So in sum, we established that women and peers are disproportionately affected by research anxiety, and we identified this research anxiety as a factor that we can work on to lessen in order to create a more inclusive scientific community. And we identified these 4 factors that are increasing student anxiety that can easily be targeted, I shouldn't say easily, but that could potentially be targeted for future interventions. So lack of research success, lack of knowledge, flexible schedules, and people. All right, so now that we've dove into anxiety and undergraduate research experiences, I want to take a look at depression. So go ahead, contribute to the chat again for me. What about undergraduate research might affect students' feelings of depression? All right, there might be a lag on my time. Oh, there they all flew in. Okay. Being away from friends and family, grades, always being in the lab, results that are different from what you'd expect. Yep, failing in research, trying and failing, and then going back to that advisor, someone who's not supportive, and then you might get caught in that negative depression loop again. All right, so all really interesting ideas. I think that many of these undergraduates touched on. So again, let's compare kind of how these thoughts compare with what we found. So here we recruited, so from this list, now we had a listserv of students, right? From this huge survey that we had done for the research anxiety survey. And we had asked students whether or not they'd be willing to participate in an interview about their experience in undergraduate research. So we sent out a recruitment interview email to all of our students at R1 institutions. And we recruited just any student who identified with having depression, who is doing undergraduate research currently. And we never require a student to be diagnosed with depression, and that's because we know that mental health care services are disproportionately unavailable to a lot of our underrepresented and underserved students, particularly our low SES students or our students coming from low income backgrounds. And so we take them on their word. I think if you have experienced depression, you know you experienced depression, and that's good enough for us. So we recruited 35 students. They happen to come from 12 research intensive institutions who self-identified as having depression. With regard to our interview studies, we usually see patterns with 6 students, and that's consistent with qualitative literature. We usually see all patterns by 12 students, and that was consistent with what we saw here. And we're always willing to interview any student who signs up with us because we want to give them that respect, and it gives us that much more richness to our data. We conducted hour-long interview, semi-structured interviews, exploring students' experiences with depression, and using inductive coding, we identified themes in the interviews that were reported by at least 20% of our students. So why an interview study? Once again, there was nothing on the prior literature, absolutely nothing about the experiences of undergraduates with depression that can inform this survey. And there's actually really still very little literature on grad student depression. So again, had we come up with our own predetermined factors, we likely would have missed something. There were people with depression on our research team, and again, everyone comes with their own biases, and also there were people without depression who probably can't, have that insight to come up with some of these ideas. And again, I can confirm, having done these interviews, this is not something that our undergraduates think about regularly. They don't often I don't think anyone gives them permission to think about how something like undergraduate research affects their depression, right? So if we're asking them to write about them quickly, their answers might be short-sighted at best and perhaps inaccurate at worst, again, if they're trying to rush through one of those surveys. All right, so we found that depression in undergraduate research can be affected by the lab environment and social connections. Particularly, students struggled when they were alone in the lab, which could lead them to focus on negative thoughts. So for example, student 28 said, "When I go into the office at night, I'm prone to being more depressed. It's being alone. I think about the mistakes or trying to correct mistakes. I think I'm way too self-evaluating, way too self-deprecating. When I'm alone, those things are really, really triggered. When I'm talking with somebody else, I forget about those things." Now, the converse is true. Positive social interactions were really helpful for students with depression. So student 1 said, "I think always checking in on undergrads is important. It's really easy for us to go a whole day without talking to anybody in the lab, but our grad students are like, hey, what's up? How's school? What's going on? Sometimes just talking can really help you get out of that negative spiral and can help with depression." Now, a lot of our students described mentors who were generally in a bad mood and how that could trickle down to grad students and trickle down negatively affect the undergrads. And that's all in the paper, but I want to emphasize that others described much more harmful relationships that affected their depression. So student 11 said, "I had a primary investigator who's notorious for screaming at people, being emotionally abusive, unreasonable, etc. Being yelled at and constantly demeaned and harassed at all hours of the day, day and night, that was pretty bad for me." In addition, as many of you predicted, we found that failing in science, making errors, getting help, and receiving feedback could affect depression. Particularly, students described that when science failed, their depression often worsened. So student 25 said, "Not getting things right triggers my depression. Having to do an experiment over and over again, that work is pretty meticulous, and it's frustrating when I do a whole experiment and I don't get the results I can use." Now, if students experience failure in science, obviously that could be challenging, but it was especially bad if they felt like they had no one to go to ask for help. So student 6 said, "It just feels like the graduate students are not approachable. I can't just approach them to ask for their understanding in a certain situation. It makes my depression worse because I feel like I'm stuck and there's nothing I can do. So then I feel like it's my fault I can't do anything." Further, students describe that it can be really helpful for them when their mentors praise them when they're doing a good job. And this is something concrete that I personally took away, because when we asked them, "Why is hearing praise from your mentor so helpful?" Student 16 says, "Because a lot of my depression focuses on everybody secretly hates you, nobody likes you, you're going to die alone. So having that validation from my graduate mentor is important because it flies in the face of what my depression tells me." So in sum, we were able to identify some factors that we could potentially target to improve the experiences of students with depression in research. Specifically, the lab environment. So again, fostering that positive environment from the PI to the grad students that goes down to the undergrads. Normalizing failure. So I think that sometimes PIs will normalize failure with grad students, or grad students normalize failure with each other, but this is not trickling down to our undergrads. And then mentor relationships, right? Just treating undergrads with like decency and respect, but also remembering to give them that praise and encouragement that can be potentially disproportionately effective for our students with depression. All right, so one of the most interesting things to me about depression is that it's a concealable, stigmatized identity. And that's because it can be concealed, right? And it carries a stigma, which can result in the loss of status or discrimination. And individuals have to reveal concealable, stigmatized identities in order for other people to know that they identify that way and in order to seek help. So you might be thinking about your own lab. How do you know who has depression? And this is something we were really interested in because we know from the literature that concealing depression can lead to psychological distress. And we know from recent mentoring literature that effective mentoring requires that faculty have an awareness of identity-related challenges their mentees have. So in the same depression interviews, we asked students a series of questions about who they came out to. Do you reveal depressions to undergrads, to other grad students and postdocs, or to faculty, and why they chose to reveal and conceal their identity. So remember, these were hour-long interviews. So this gave us a ton of time to really dive into a lot of different ideas. But on the other side, when we were analyzing our data, it was way too much for one paper. I tried to make it one paper, but then I realized we were writing so much, no one was ever going to read that paper. So we really stepped back and looked at the stories we wanted to tell, and we saw that there were two distinct stories. And one was really how depression affects research and how research affects depression. And the other one is focused on concealable, stigmatized identities. So we use this lens of concealable, stigmatized identities to organize this next paper, and we grounded our findings in this disclosure process model. And this briefly suggests that when individuals disclose a concealable, stigmatized identity, or a CSI, it can affect their lives in three ways. It provides alleviation of inhibition, so you alleviate because you're no longer inhibited, because you're no longer hiding. It changes your social support. It can change it for the good or for the bad, and it can change social information, so what people know about you. And again, that can be a negative or a positive thing. So we used inductive coding to identify themes, because again, we didn't go in with the assumption that any of this was going to apply in this unique context. But once we had our themes, we used these existing models to interpret our findings. All right, so I was going to ask you to contribute to the chat, but because for the sake of time, I'm gonna just reveal some of these responses. But think in your head, what % of students do you predict reveal their depression to another undergraduate? So we found that it was only 37%. So only less than 40% of our undergrads have told even another undergraduate that they're struggling with depression. What about our grad students or our postdocs? We see it's even less, a quarter of our students. And what about faculty? Here, 7%, which was 2 students, which I can say we noted that both of these students, neither was by choice. Both students were in a situation where their depression was so severe that they had to reveal the depression to the faculty member. And when we asked our students about why they conceal, a primary reason was that they were worried that they were going to be treated negatively by members of the lab. And particularly, they thought projects were going to be taken away, right? That they were going to lose authority, that projects were going to be given to other people who didn't have depression. And so those things really weighed on them. They also didn't trust other people not to tell about their depression. So they were worried that if they told a particular person, that person might turn around and say it jokingly or just compromise their trust and spread that around. And also students said, I just don't have that time or ability to develop the relationship I need to feel comfortable revealing my depression to other people in the lab. All right, so we talked about quite a lot today with anxiety and depression. And so to briefly summarize, when we think about anxiety and active learning, we found that the increased number of social interactions in active learning increases students' anxiety, and primarily because it exacerbates their fear of being judged in this new social situation. Now, with anxiety and undergraduate research, we found that anxiety in undergrad research disproportionately affects women and peer students, and it also can negatively predict a student's intention to pursue a career in research. With depression, we're just beginning to establish that it can affect our students' experiences in active learning, but we're already seeing elements of active learning, such as social interactions, that can exacerbate student depression. And finally, the lab environment, student-mentor relationships, the amount of guidance students receive, and the experiences and failing in science can all affect student depression. So with that, I would like to acknowledge my collaborators, particularly Sarah Brownell from Arizona State University. Virginia Downing works on all the anxiety work with me. She's fantastic, as well as Logan Jin, and he works primarily on all of the depression work with me. And then our additional collaborators who have worked on various ones of these projects, Sarah Eddy, Lorena, Liz, and Jack. And with that, I'll take any questions. I have the 4 papers that I reviewed up here on the screen with the QR code, so feel free to grab those if you want to read more about it. Obviously, I wish I had endless amounts of time to chat about it, but this is a quick way to dive into that work. So yeah, I'm happy to take any questions. I also have my website up there as well as my Twitter handle.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katie. Really appreciate it. Is it okay if we take maybe like 10 minutes for questions?
Yeah, that's what I was hoping. I know we started a little late, but I think my talk was 50 minutes, so I absolutely have 10 minutes.
No, that's fine. Thank you for sharing all that. It's really incredible. I mean, I have plenty of questions, but I'm sure our audience has a lot of questions as well. So if y'all would like, please, y'all feel free to type a question in the chat. Katie, if there's one that you would want to address, feel free to point it out. Also, if anybody has would like to raise their hand to ask in person, we can do that as well. I'll give you some time for y'all to think of the questions or raise your hand.
All right, we have a question from Constance. She said, hi Constance, by the way, I've met Constance before at UCF. I was wondering if you considered asking instructors about their anxiety with using active learning strategies or techniques. That's a really great question. So we thought about it. I'm less interested in the instructor side, so this isn't something that I'm personally exploring. But I think that that's a really interesting question, especially with things like cold call and random call, and when instructors have to think on their feet and when they put themselves in the situation of potentially being negatively evaluated. I think that that's a really interesting question. Somewhat relatedly, we are kicking off a study looking at a bunch of identities of, I'm trying to remember, it's across STEM faculty, particularly focusing on CSI, concealable stigmatized identities, and how faculty are navigating whether they reveal or conceal their identities, and how that affects students. So that's somewhat unrelated, but we haven't looked particularly at what Constance is asking about, how their anxiety is affected in the context of active learning. All right, I think we have a question from Danny. When doing semi-structured interviews, how do you guard against personal biases when pursuing interesting things during the interview? And when identifying key messages during analysis, I do semi-structured interviews too and worry about stuff falling in the cracks between the framework and my efforts to be objective. That's a great question. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think sometimes who we are makes our research so interesting, right? And I think that, for example, I led a study on LGBTQ+ students. I'm gay. I think me knowing what it's like to be gay and closeted in a space, I was able to know what question to ask next that was going to be interesting. And so I think in a lot of ways, that's where the positionality statement can be really impactful in a paper, to let the audience know who you are and where you're coming from, right? And so I think that it's not terrible, especially in those semi-structured interviews. You have that set list of questions that ideally have been vetted by others in your lab who you've collaborated on, and those are ideally not biased, right? But when you're exploring, the whole point of a semi-structured interview is to go find something really interesting, and maybe it just is a spark for a new study. Maybe you're not going to write about it. But I would say that in a lot of ways, my identities have have been a plus in being able to ask those unstructured questions, right? And identifying an interesting idea that maybe goes into the next project. So I would say I really embrace my identities, and I try to, make sure I'm working with other people with different identities to come up with that initial interview script. And sometimes two people are interviewing, right? And in that case, we're doing our practice interviews together. So we'll get folks from the lab to sit for 2, 3, 4 practice interviews, especially if that co-interviewer is newer to the process, and make sure that we're identifying similarly. And we also have meetings as we go, especially if we're interviewing like 50 students. Like, it can be great to meet every 10 students to check in and see, just talk about what things are coming up, so that you're checking yourself and you're not, oh, I'm not talking about something random for 15 minutes if this other person's never talking about. So I don't know, Danny, if that answers your question a little bit, but I would say, yeah, in some, I try to embrace that. I try to go with the things that I think are interesting. And I think that I agree that using a single framework can sometimes, I'm really drawn to this exploratory work, because I think that the fun part is seeing how a framework fits into your work, but then also how it does it, right? Also, what are the new things popping out about this new context that are really different from a framework that's existed in another scenario, in another environment, or with a different identity. So I wouldn't, personally, I don't feel afraid to go outside of that framework and say, hey, these are ways in which it didn't work, right? Or didn't fit with this particular group or this particular set of students. Hannah says, you mentioned earlier that you had too much data to say and you had to split survey responses into 2 papers. How did you know to split that research into 2 papers rather than the initial one? Great question. It was not easy. I think that initially we thought that it was all going to go into one. And I started mapping the paper, and I was like, oh my gosh, this paper is going to be like 70 pages. And it was so interesting. And I know I'm biased, but I was like, this is super interesting. I'm not willing to cut it, right? And it was enough that I had 2 stories, and it was enough that it could be 2 papers. And I think what was also really interesting is that we had this CSI framework, which was really theoretically, had been explored in other areas and was theoretically grounded, and our other work was really exploratory. So that split became clearer when we knew that, one, we could dive into these existing models and use the existing theory, and the other was more exploratory. So that's how we made that decision. But I've had plenty of instances where we've published papers and we're like, that could have been 3 papers, or the reverse, where we've, where you have to make that decision. So it's not easy. Okay, Brian said there might be one more question. Yeah, Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, if nobody has another question, I'm willing to ask a question. So you did mention you stopped that one study because of COVID. Because students' depressions and anxieties may be exacerbated. And I'm over here thinking about the case of Phineas Gage, right? In which there was like a steel rod that went through his head, and he survived, and people found it very like fascinating, and like they went out and studied it, right? And so there was this very like extreme case that kind of like exemplified and accentuated things that people who are kind of studying and provided allowed for this knowledge, right, that came from that. So in this sense, like the things that you're studying may have been exacerbated to the point that they could have been more detectable and made more salient. So did that cross your mind? And if so, like, why is there like value to pursuing that, or is there reasons to not pursue that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there were so many confounding factors that we worried that we were no longer going to be able to get at our true research question, which was how active learning affects anxiety. And we were worried that we were going to get at how transitioning online affects anxiety, and how a lack of structure affects anxiety, and how all these other things affect anxiety, but that aren't maybe parts of typical active learning classes. So what we did, exactly what you were saying, is we were like, how does this affect, we were so interested in our students with disabilities, because our students with disabilities have accommodations often set in their classes, their active learning classes. They know what they're going to do, how they're going to go about doing it, and all of a sudden it got totally flipped on its head. right? And so we actually took that time to stop that study because we knew we weren't going to be able to answer our research questions and go for what we thought was most interesting and most critical and what could inform kind of longer term situations if this happens again, if something similar happens, looking at online instruction broadly. And we looked at how individuals with disabilities were experiencing the transition to online science coursework during COVID-19. So that is currently being written up as fast as possible while it's still relevant. But that was our decision making there. And I'm happy to stick around if more folks have questions. So no rush on my half. But I know you guys are a lot later than me, so it's only 4 o'clock here, or 5 o'clock now. We have time.
Thank you for that. Yeah. So any other questions from our audience? It looks like people are tired. But no, thank you so much, Dr. Katie Cooper. Really appreciate your insights and really sharing your processes and your reasons for doing your work and how you did it. We've learned so much, and we're looking forward to hearing again from you. For our audience, keep in mind that this is the first of our series. We're going to have another event coming up next month. We'll be featuring Miguel Rodriguez, who's currently a postdoc at the University of Utah. We'll be giving details about what he will be talking as we go. So once again, before we finish the call, let's give it up for our great featured guest, Dr. Katie Cooper. Drop some hype in the chat. Yeah, emos, you know it. Thank you so much, Dr. Cooper. Really appreciate you. And we'll be staying in touch. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, thank you all for having me. I really appreciate it. This is a great group. I'm glad I know about you all and can hopefully come pick your brains at some point because this is a great group of really smart people. So thanks so much. And yeah, hopefully I will see you all around once life returns to normal.
Hopefully. Thank you so much. Y'all take care.
Bye, everyone.